Fait que merci. On va prendre votre prochain point à l'ordre du jour, le point numéro 16. Les gras saturés, une nouvelle perspective. Je vais vous présenter notre invité, M. Andrew Samis. M. Samis est médecin spécialisé en chirurgie générale et en soins intensifs. Il travaille en chirurgie cardiaque à l'Université Queen's, où il est professeur adjoint. Oui. Je vais terminer la présentation, mais c'est sûr que je vais vous inviter à aller chercher des écouteurs. M. Samis est un anglophone, ça va vous prendre des écouteurs. Ces 30 dernières années successives d'études universitaires font de lui l'étudiant possédant le plus d'années consécutives d'études de l'histoire de l'Université Queen's. M. Samis voue un intérêt pour la recherche dans les domaines de l'alimentation et des maladies cardiovasculaires. Il a publié plusieurs études à ce sujet et est membre de plusieurs comités d'experts nationaux qui s'affairent à l'élaboration de lignes directrices en matière d'alimentation et en maladies cardiovasculaires. Fait particulier, M. Samis a mené une seconde carrière en tant que soldat de la réserve des Forces armées canadiennes. Il a pris sa retraite après 29 ans de service au rang de lieutenant-colonel. Il vit à Kingston avec sa femme et ses 4 enfants. Fait que, accueillez M. Andrew Samis.
Thank you, everyone. Very happy to be here in Quebec City. I hope you were all well, and I hope your legs aren't too sore from dancing last night. I wanted to talk to you about, really about saturated fat. All of you are in the industry that makes saturated fat, and for so many years we have heard people saying that saturated fat in your diet is associated with heart attack and stroke. And I think you would be surprised to hear the story of how we got to that, and be surprised to hear that mostly there isn't any evidence for that. And when I heard that Health Canada was coming out with a new food guide, myself and a number of other people were excited when we heard that news, because we thought that finally we were going to get it right with respect to saturated fat. But we were shocked and surprised to see that guiding principle that said Health Canada was going to restrict food that was high in saturated fat, and are proposing putting warning labels on that. And strictly as from a scientific point of view, there really isn't any evidence for that. But let me take you through the story of how we got to this point of seeing saturated fat as a villain. Some disclosures: I'm not financially associated with really any organization. My job is to look after patients. I treat people who have stroke, and I treat people who have heart disease, and really I am here as an advocate for the patients. Despite the fact that you are an industry group, for me, it's all about the science and what's best for people, and that's what's most important for me. So, let me start by telling you a story. Well, really, it's a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a drug called adipimin. And in older times, at the turn of the century, they developed a way of simulating a heart attack in a rabbit. And they found if they fed this special plant to these animals, including rabbits, that they got less heart attacks. So along came a famous scientist. And this famous scientist said, hey, there are countries that eat more of this plant and they have less heart disease. And it's adipimin in this plant, therefore everyone should take adipimin. But the scientist said, there's no evidence for this. What if it's unsafe? And the famous scientist went to the big heart organization and said, everyone should take this. And they said, there's no evidence for this. And he was very sad. But then he joined the big heart organization and got on their nutrition committee And soon they started to say everyone should take adipamine, but oh yes, there is no evidence, but we know the evidence is coming soon. And he became even more famous. And a decade goes by, and then a U.S. senator, a famous U.S. senator, decides it makes sense to me that the U.S. Senate should decide what pill to take to prevent heart attack and stroke. I mean, to everyone else, it should probably be a medical decision, but it makes total sense to me that the U.S. Senate should make this decision. And they had hearings, and they heard from people, and they heard from the industry that made adipamine, and they heard from the scientists who said there isn't any evidence. What if it's unsafe? We should not issue guidelines. But the senator said everyone should take it. It's too important to wait for evidence. And 2 decades go by, and now everyone is saying it. The governments are saying it. The Heart and Stroke is saying it. Health Canada is saying it. Everyone is saying it. They forgot the fact that this was issued without any evidence ever. And of course, way in the background are the scientists saying, can we please use evidence? Well, of course, that's the end of my fairy tale. And of course, it's a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale because adipamine is a drug. And we do not issue drugs to help prevent or cure disease without a very rigorous scientific approach. This could never happen with a drug. We don't prescribe to you a drug that isn't proven. But what if adipamine is a food? And I didn't choose that name at random. It's a made-up name, but adipis is Latin for beef tallow or fat, and minus is Latin for less. So if adipamine is actually the low-fat doctrine, then perhaps this isn't a fairy tale. So let's talk about fat. So everyone sees that picture there, and they kind of cringe a little bit. It kind of makes them uncomfortable. Fat is a third of our diet. Why are you looking at that thinking, hey, there's a heart attack about to happen? Because it's a third of our diet, and it's an important nutrient. But we've been immersed in it in our society. We've been immersed in it. I took these screenshots from the exact same time off the internet. And on the left, you will see the benefits of low fat, fat-free, the 1984 Time magazine with cholesterol with a frowny face bacon. And on the right side, saturated fat's good for you. 12 reasons saturated fat's good for you. Fat and cholesterol is good for you. No wonder people are confused. Today we'll talk about the history of how we've got where we're at and discuss where we can go from here with a little bit of talk about the food guide. A little quick bit of chemistry. This is what a fat looks like. It's got fatty acid tails, a glycerol molecule up and down. It looks like kind of an E. And hard fat or saturated fat, those E's are straight. All those little white circles are hydrogens, and they completely saturate the black carbon, so you have nice little straight E's, and they pack together nicely and are solid at room temperature. And those are the animal fats. The unsaturated fats are missing a couple of H's, so they're not saturated in them. It produces a little crinkle in the fatty acid, and that crinkle means they can't pack together so tightly, so they're liquid, and that's our vegetable oils. An easy way to remember is you want animals to be solid and not liquid. This is the final table, and this is an overall view of fats. So on the left, you'll see saturated fats, and you'll see the things that contain it. Now, that's mostly talking about dairy and meat, essentially. I mean, dark chocolate's on the list, and some of you probably try and have an entire diet of dark chocolate, but realistically, we're talking about meat and dairy. The monounsaturated fatty acids, that you can put a circle around those, that's the Mediterranean style of eating. And then finally, the polyunsaturated. And the polyunsaturated comprise omega-3s, which are those the cod liver oils and the salmon oils, which really is a small component and may be helpful. And then there's the omega-6s. And the omega-6s are all of those things that people have tried to get you to switch from saturated fat to. So that's your margarine and your vegetable oils, your safflower oil, your sunflower oil. And then we have trans fats with that dotted line. And trans fats are artificial. Trans fats are making unsaturated fats solid so that the shelf life of baked goods will last longer. They're made in a factory, they are bad, and they should not be part of the diet. But they shouldn't be confused with the rest of the part, which are all natural ingredients. So let's talk about the history of how we come to think of fat as bad. We really start, the term atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, really started in 1904 when a German pathologist, Felix Marchand, at the University of Leipzig described these plaques. And he used that term, Greek for ather, meaning gruel or porridge, and scleros, meaning hard porridge of the arteries. It's only been since 1904 that we had this. And I've included his picture here because he has the look of exactly what we want our university professors to look like. That scowl and the beard. In 1908, 4 years later, in the Russian Imperial Medical Academy, Dr. Ignatowski fed rabbits full-fat milk, eggs, and meat, and found they got a yellow gunk, a yellow deposit in their aorta that looked like what Dr. Marchand had described. And so he started to wonder if this was atherosclerosis. And then there are 3 critical people in the history of vilifying fat, and the first is a great scientist by the name of Nikolai Anishkov, and he was Russian, and he was doing his PhD at the time in the Russian Imperial Medical Academy when Dr. Ignatowski was feeding the rabbits meat and eggs. And what he found was that it was cholesterol that was doing it. And so he did a long series of experiments starting in 1913 and running till about 1940, and he was a great scientist. It just so happens that science in that day is different from now, and his theory wasn't correct. But over the next few years, and by the way, there are more words on these slides than are there. These slides are made in part that people can read them later. But his team found that it was cholesterol in these animals that were causing the deposits. And he started to formulate this idea that eating cholesterol clogged your arteries. However, they conveniently ignored the fact that dogs and rats, animals that naturally ate meat, did not get these deposits. In fact, you can imagine how happy the dogs were in these experiments when they found out they were just going to be fed a high-meat diet. They also noted that the cholesterol levels in these rabbits, natural herbivores that don't eat cholesterol, they don't eat animal products, was 5 times what you see in people, and that it was depositing in the muscles, it was depositing in the tendons, it was depositing in the ligaments. It was a cholesterol overload because they have evolved no mechanism to excrete it. But then 2 other things happened that kind of was unfortunate along these lines. And one was that Dr. Carl Mueller discovered a congenital condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. And that's where you have inherited a genetic defect and your cholesterol is extremely high. And these people get early heart disease. But the condition, the way they get it is different than this, but it seemed exactly like what Dr. Anishkov was saying. It's too much cholesterol. And then Dr. Goffman discovered the 2 types of cholesterol in the blood and how to measure it, and people could start measuring it. So by about 1951, we had this lipid hypothesis. This lipid hypothesis was that you eat meat, you eat eggs, you eat cheese, you eat cholesterol-laden things, and like hot grease down a cold drain, it clogs up your arteries. Now, a lot of you still sort of harbor this idea that you eat cholesterol might be bad for you. If your doctor tells you that you have high cholesterol, you stop eating eggs or you eat egg whites only. I'm here to tell you, because you may not have heard this, that is completely false. Eating cholesterol going in your mouth, does not affect the cholesterol in your blood, nor does it affect heart disease. You may not have heard this because there is lots of money around issuing of guidelines and distributing them through the world, but when they're proven to be wrong, there isn't any money to get the word out to correct that. Eating cholesterol is wrong, but in 1951, it seemed like a really, really good idea. And they said that cholesterol was like biologic rust for your vessels. And so, lipid hypothesis, in the 1950s, eat cholesterol, goes into your blood, causes heart disease, is false, but that's where this started. There was a scientist at the time, Dr. Pete Ahrens, and he was a true scientist, and he always believed in looking at the evidence, and he was one of the very early people in this, and he never really believed this, and he continued to be a voice of reason through his lifetime. And I'll come back to him in a second, but I thought he should, I should present him because he really was a voice of reason throughout this. But the second person that really influenced things is Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys was from the University of Minnesota, and he was an American physiologist, and he studied diet in the forms of malnutrition mainly and nutrition. But he was very influential. He was a very forceful man, force of character. His colleagues said sort of he was more forceful than he was right a lot of the times, but very influential. How influential? Well, these are K rations from the U.S. Army in the Second World War. These are the rations paratroopers and tank crews used. The K stands for Keys because Ansel Keys convinced the Department of Defense that he should design these. He did a little bit of a change to it. He was at Rome at a conference, and while he was in Rome, they told him that they don't have as much heart disease as you do in the United States here in Italy. And so he looked, and his wife was a lab technician who'd learned this new skill to measure cholesterol. So he went to the workers and he measured their cholesterol and it was low. And then he went out to the Rotary Club where they said they had pasta loaded with meat sauce and Parmesan cheese and roast beef and pastry and ice cream, which he saw, of course, as being fatty foods, but you could also see it as being sugar and starch-laden foods. And he measured the cholesterol at the Rotary Club, and it was higher. And he did the same thing in Madrid, and he formed what he called the diet heart hypothesis. He did a little bit of a switch. He switched that cholesterol eating to saturated fat eating, and this is where it started with Ansel Keys' theory. So he said, he called the diet heart hypothesis, still around today, and I accentuate the word hypothesis, is that saturated fat increases blood cholesterol and causes heart disease. That is where it started. He started this because he formed the 7-country study. In the 7-country studies, he looked at those 7 countries you see on the screen, and he found that in those countries where they eat more meat and dairy, they had more heart disease. And where they eat less meat and dairy, they had less heart disease. However, those are only 7 countries. In Yugoslavia, they smoke like it's a cure for cancer. In Finland, they only had fresh food and vegetable for 4 months of the year. And so there's lots of confounding variables. But the biggest blow to his theory was this, and that's the fact that there were evidence from 21 different countries. And you can see the line on the left that he drew through those 7 countries. Eat more meat and dairy, more heart disease. But when you include all 21 countries, especially countries like France and Germany that eat more meat and dairy and have less heart disease, there really wasn't an effect. However, and the American Heart Association, which had become very important, continued to say in 1958 and 1959 and 1960, no, we are not publishing your diet heart hypothesis. We don't believe there's any evidence for it. When we looked at all 21 countries, there was no effect of eating saturated fat and heart disease. Your idea is a theory, but we can't publish it. But in 1960, Ansel Keys joined the Nutrition Committee. That's the Nutrition Committee there. A cardiologist from the Cleveland Clinic, a cardiologist from the Mayo Clinic, a cardiologist from Northwestern, a cardiologist from University of California at San Francisco, a cardiologist from Harvard, and Ansel Keys, PhD, a physiologist from Minnesota. Very influential, not a cardiologist, a member of the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association, and like magic in 1961, they published their first dietary guidelines, which essentially said, eat less fat, eat less saturated fat, but it has right at the end of the paper, more complete information must be obtained before conclusions can be reached. We don't do this anymore. We do not publish hypotheses for people to try. We don't do experiments on people. We don't, in mainstream journals like this is one of the most mainstream journals, the Journal of the American Medical Association, no one in their right mind today would put out a hypothesis as a recommendation without proof. But it happened. It happened because Ansel Keys was very influential, and we now have this being distributed through the world. He got on the cover of Time magazine. When President Eisenhower had his heart attack, the president's doctor called up Ansel Keys, and they put President Eisenhower on as low-fat diet as he possibly could. Anecdotally, President Eisenhower's cholesterol was never better than when he had his heart attack because they measured it every month, but they continued to remove the fat, and his cholesterol continued to go up. By 1969, there still was no evidence, and Pete Ahrens said as much. He said in 1969, it is not known whether dietary manipulation has any effect on heart attacks. The evidence wasn't there, despite the fact that the recommendations were. But things really, really, really changed in 1977. And this is George McGovern. Many of you may know him. He was a U.S. senator. He was a senator from South Dakota. His background was history. He did his PhD in history on the coal strike in Colorado in 1913. Not a scientist whatsoever. A very impressive guy, though. He ran against Richard Nixon in the election in '72. The Watergate break-in was into his headquarters. He was popular enough in the United States, he actually guest hosted Saturday Night Live. And George McGovern formed a committee of the U.S. Senate because he thought that the U.S. Senate should actually make this decision about what foods are important for health. Most of you here would say, you know, that's probably a scientific decision, but no, they decided the U.S. Senate was going to. And they had a bunch of hearings. And at the hearings, the leading scientists of the day pleaded and pleaded with Senator McGovern not to release the recommendations without evidence. And one of the most famous quotes of all of this was Dr. Pete Ahrens, who said, "Advising Americans to eat less fat on the strength of such marginal evidence was equivalent to conducting a nutritional experiment with the American public as the subjects." And Dr. Robert Olson, and I have a video of it, I'd like you to listen to it here. This is Dr. Robert Olson talking to Senator McGovern and pleading with him not to release his guidelines, specifically talking about reducing saturated fat.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
Waiting until every last shred of evidence is in. You can see there, the scientists are pleading for him not to do this. And in fact, there's been some reviews since that time which have simply said, the U.S. Senate sat there, and usually it's easy because the scientists come up and say, this is how it is, this is how it is, this is how it is, and the Senate puts that out. But the scientists couldn't agree. There wasn't any evidence. And so when the scientists can't agree, the senators were professionally incapable of solving this. They turned to the scientists to do this, and the scientists couldn't because there wasn't any evidence. So the non-scientific groups carried the day. And you had the groups that weren't the scientists really deciding what was in it because the scientists couldn't decide. And so here's what he said. This is his dietary goals. And I point out his committee included some famous people like Hubert Humphrey, Robert Dole, Ted Kennedy. And they said, basically, from the fat point of view, increase your carbohydrate consumption, reduce overall fat, reduce saturated fat, and reduce cholesterol. But again, this is a decision of the U.S. Senate, but it was put forward with huge amounts of PR money, and out it goes to the American public. And I can tell you, when they put something like this to the American public, it influences the Canadian public. This is the start of the real push to reduce saturated fat, and it came from the U.S. Senate when the scientists could not come to consensus and pleaded with them not to release it. Many of you may be hearing this for the first time, but the start of this low-fat doctrine comes from a politician influenced by groups that weren't scientists, and it's pushed forward to the world. Was there actually any evidence? Well, we now know there was no evidence. And I know you're not familiar with reading science, but those plots right there, this was a study done in 2015 by a British researcher. But you see the number 1 and the dots above it? Those are all the studies. If things bridge the 1, if the wide lines cross 1, it means there's no effect. So at the time that Senator McGovern released his report, by modern scientific analysis of all the evidence available at the time, there wasn't any evidence. We ended up with guidelines for people that were not scientifically valid. So I've got you all the way to 1977, from the meat-fed rabbits in Russia to the cholesterol, to Ancel Keys changing cholesterol to dairy and meat being bad, to the U.S. Senate releasing it to the public, and you'll notice that all the way along, there has been no scientific evidence. But the U.S. continued to release their DGAs every 5 years by an act, the National Monitoring and Related Research Act. They must put out their guidelines. And in Canada, we have our food guide. Well, we used to have the food rules in 1942, and then the food rules changed to the food guide in 1961. But interestingly, in the 1977 food guide, this is the year of McGovern, the term meat is replaced with cooked lean meat, and the servings of carbohydrate goes up. In the 1982 one, there's a new section called moderation, which mentions food with limited amounts of fat. And in 1992, magically and without explanation, cheese disappears from the food guide. I can tell you that in 1961 and 49 and 44, cheese was an important part of the food guide, and it just magically disappeared. Do you see those Surgeon Generals there, all 7 of them? From 1988 till 1999, the U.S. Surgeon General's office decided to write the definitive report on fat, and after 11 years, they swept it under the carpet. They never could reach a conclusion, and they folded the project, and the reason was that they couldn't find the science behind it. They couldn't make the recommendations. However, throughout the 1970s to 2000, the American public listened, and so did the Canadian, and they reduced the amount of fat they ate. They reduced the fat from 40% of their calories to 34%. And also at this time, a huge industry around low-fat diet started. These are the 2006 guidelines, the American Heart Association. You remember those 1961 guidelines? These guidelines say, eat less fat, eat less saturated fat. These are the same guidelines as the 1961. To put this in perspective, when real science moves forward, things advance and change. They don't stay the same. It's just over 60 years from the Wright brothers taking off till man landing on the moon. If your family member was a patient of mine in the ICU, and I came out and sat down in the waiting room and said to you, I'm going to use the same drugs and the same ventilation strategy and the same treatment that we used in 1961, you would think I was crazy. The fact that these guidelines never changed for all those 40-something years is because there was no science guiding it. Because when science happens, it moves forward. But we lost our way. We truly lost our way. These are true screen captures. Fat-free gummy bears, eat those for your health. Fat-free jubes, eat those for your health. Hey, how about some fat-free pudding? Eat something that's healthy. We lost our way. George Foreman, all you got to do is put it in the grill and watch the fat drip out and it's going to be healthy. It's not. It's not about the fat. We need to demand the evidence and think critically. We need to analyze every food guideline for the science behind it. Let me talk about a few things. Cholesterol. Cholesterol is very, very important for your body. It's key. It keeps your membranes moving so that we can move as animals. Plants have rigid cell walls. They stand stiff. We are moving around as animals, and if we don't have a body full of cholesterol, then we can't move around. It's also important for the production of certain vitamins and hormones. Your body has about 35,000 milligrams of cholesterol in it, and it needs 1,300 milligrams a day. Average person takes in about 307, and because of that, your body makes the difference to bring it up to 1,300. If you eat less cholesterol, your body makes more. If you eat more cholesterol, your body makes less. Cholesterol has very little impact, eating it, on anything to do with heart disease. Canada never had a cap on cholesterol, ever. We had 2 committees, one in '88 and one in 1990, and they recommended no cap on cholesterol because cholesterol is unimportant for heart disease. Ansel Keys himself didn't believe it was. Where does this 300 milligrams a day come from? It comes from the McGovern report. It comes from the U.S. Senate, written by U.S. Senate staffers with no scientists behind it. Now we move forward, and in 2015, the last of the U.S. guidelines came out, the last of the U.S. guidelines to come out, the most recent one, it said, cholesterol is not a nutrient for concern for overconsumption. The U.S. finally, in 2015, disregarded cholesterol as important. This isn't big news. This isn't the leading edge of science. This is the last country on earth that thought cholesterol was important, and now it's completely gone. Completely gone. So number 4 of McGovern is gone, is wrong, was an error, and yet we released it with huge amount of fanfare. I actually found this on the Dietitians of Canada website back in October of 2016. I called them up and they took it down. And they apologized and said they hadn't had a chance to review it because cholesterol is not important. I'm sitting at my family doctor's office. They have one of those health screens that come out. And it says, nuts are cholesterol-free, which is important in a heart-healthy diet. Cholesterol-free is not important in a heart-healthy diet. That is an error, and that just shows you how hard it is to get rid of this. That was at my family doctor's office. And look, this is my hand taken with my cell phone holding my yogurt as I take it out of my fridge. And cholesterol is on the label as if to make it important. Well, why would that be? Where would this come from? Well, it actually comes from the Government of Canada website. This is Health Canada. And they say, for healthy diet, reduce the amount of cholesterol, no. Saturated fat, no. And trans fats, yes. So they link the other two with trans fats. And then they said the daily value that they're calculating is the 300 milligrams. That comes from McGovern's report of the U.S. Senate, not from science. Total fat. People listened. This is what happened between McGovern and 2012. People reduced the overall amount of fat in their diet. We now know from this study that the total amount of fat, that's vegetable and animal fats in your diet, is not related. There is no health benefits to reducing the total amount of fat in your diet. So this recommendation from McGovern, point 2, is also wrong. So big U.S. guidelines issued, 2 of them were wrong. What about saturated fat? And this is the point that all of you are interested in here. Saturated fat, meat and dairy, what's the relevance of it? It's probably the most important question in human diet right now, and we have 3 strategies. And remember, fat is just a third of your diet. Everyone's obsessing about this third and not talking about the other 2/3. This is how much polyunsaturated, saturated, which is SFA, and MUFA people eat. So this is one way to do it. This is reduce saturated fat, meat and dairy, and increase PUFAs, which is the vegetable oils. This is what the low-fat people believe. Option 2 would be decrease saturated fat and increase the MUFAs. This is the Mediterranean style of diet from Ansel Keys. But the third is that saturated fatty acids are not related to heart disease, and we should stop talking about them. We should stop talking about reducing dairy. We should start talking about reducing meat because it's not scientifically relevant in this discussion. This was the state of the literature way back when. And this is the state of the literature right now. That's called being in a state of equipoise or equal studies. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you there isn't studies to show that saturated fats like dairy are harmful. There are also studies that show them have no harm, and there are studies that show that dairy can be beneficial. The scientists can't decide. They truly can't decide. These studies, the ones under the green, good studies in major journals show that you should recommend reducing dairy. The studies under the yellow say that you should, it doesn't matter. Dairy is completely neutral, and meat and saturated fat. And the ones on the right actually say that dairy and saturated fat is associated with less heart disease and stroke, especially stroke. We have papers from all over the board. What does that mean? Well, it means that we don't know. We don't know. The scientists don't know. This is the same as in 1977. The scientists don't know. There are papers all over the place. And so, 3 of the key points of McGovern, the ones governing with fat, 2 are wrong and 1 is still unproven, which is why we don't release guidelines to the public without scientific evidence. Dairy, I'll just quickly say, there's a good systematic review of dairy which shows that dairy is associated with either neutral associations with heart disease, that is none, or some positive effects, especially with stroke, with dairy fat. So dairy fat is they call it the paradox because there's these studies that seem to suggest that dairy fat seems to be helpful in some instances. Not enough to make a guideline about, but certainly evidence to suggest you should never make a guideline against it. And butter, very simply, whenever I give this talk anywhere, the number 1 question I always get is, what about butter? Butter, butter, butter. Why? Well, at the bottom there. Just because people really like butter and they just want someone to say it's okay. And there is a study. And there's a study in 2006 which showed that butter was not associated with any heart disease, stroke, or diabetes. Butter is okay. Whenever anyone asks me about butter, this is what I tell them. Asking whether I should eat butter or not, or margarine, is like saying if I'm being attacked by a grizzly bear, should I wear a red hat or a purple hat? And the relevance is, It's an irrelevant question. It's not the issue in front of you. Eat whatever you like and feel comfortable with. It's not important to the discussion. I'm more interested as a doctor on what you're putting that butter on. Because if you're putting it on a cinnamon bun, that's what I want to talk about. If you're putting it on some fresh vegetables that are steamed, that's a better option. But the butter is an irrelevant question. And eggs, quite simply, there's a good study to suggest that eggs, up to 8 eggs a week, have no relationship, but you already know that because I told you cholesterol is not important. So the overall summary about dietary fat is cholesterol has been demonized since 1913 when they fed those rabbits meat and eggs and cream, and it's completely wrong. Cholesterol is not important. And it's still so hard to get that word out because there is no public relations campaign around it. And Health Canada, consistently on their website, still has this on it. And saturated fat, this is where it gets really concerning. Since 1977 and McGovern, we have put the word out that meat and dairy is bad and we should reduce them, and we should switch away from saturated fat and look at polyunsaturated fatty acids and the vegetable oils. But we did not tell people what to eat. We told them what not to eat, but not what to eat, and so they started eating. Many people are concerned that they started eating processed carbohydrates instead. Instead of having a piece of cheese, they had those gummy bears. And interestingly enough, it seems to be where the obesity epidemic started. So, dietary fat, trans fats are bad. We have to get trans fats. Those are those artificial fats where they take vegetable oils, they go take them to a factory, they bubble hydrogen through them, and they make things that allow the shelf life of your baked goods to last longer. But cholesterol is not important, overall fat's not important, and the scientists truly don't know if saturated fat is important. There are lots of literature trends around it, and here are some of the trends. They say that, maybe if you replace saturated fat with just carbohydrates that come from fresh fruit and veg, maybe that's an improvement. We certainly know if you replace saturated fat with sugar and flour, it seems to increase your risk of heart disease. We know that there was no difference between people that didn't eat meat and ate meat in a long study. And we do know that cheese seems to have an association with less stroke. Cheese seems to be beneficial for stroke. But what does all this mean? What do all these literature trends mean? These are not nearly at the level you would issue a guideline. You should never be issuing a guideline against saturated fat based on this evidence. And interesting, here's what's really interesting, is this is the obesity rates. This is what's happening in the Western world. Obesity is going up. And there is when McGovern started to tell us to reduce our saturated fat. As a scientist, this doesn't mean it caused it, but it's suspicious. The second we started telling people to switch away from saturated fats with meat and dairy is the beginning of what we call the obesity epidemic. There's been lots of criticism of the US DGAs, and it's ongoing, and there's public movements in the US because they came out against saturated fat, and it shocked a lot of people. And the real criticism didn't come from scientists, which is embarrassing, but it actually came from an author, because the scientists seem to be asleep at the wheel here. But Canada's Food Guide got a lot of criticism, and so they're redoing it. And so, as I said at the beginning, I was excited, like everyone else was, that finally we were going to do something right. I was on the expert panel for the Heart and Stroke Foundation position statement on saturated fat. And what we did with that position statement, which has been noted around the world in journals in England, and Harvard professors have commented, is it didn't put a limit on saturated fat. Rather, the Heart and Stroke Foundation position statement says it's the quality of your whole diet. It's getting rid of processed food and not focusing on saturated fat. Focusing on saturated fat, focusing on your industry, dairy, is called macronutrient restrictive thinking. And that means trying to restrict the macronutrients of fat or carbohydrate when people don't eat fat. People eat a diet. And you got to look at the whole quality of the diet. So they came out with a statement at guiding principle number 1, foods that are mostly unsaturated instead of foods that are saturated. And where did they get this? Well, they got it from their technical report, and unfortunately their technical report, instead of looking at scientific studies, it looked at government, federal agency guidelines, including the US DGA. So it actually used guidelines, which aren't studies. They're other people's opinions of studies rather than guidelines. So this is their technical report. They looked at guidelines from other agencies rather than looking at the scientific studies. They way too much, they just sort of copied the US guideline. It's not transparent. Nobody knows how they achieved it. In fact, they got some external experts, but their document says the reviewers were not asked to endorse the final draft or its findings. So they talked to experts, of which they note in the report, some of them said you can't really say anything against that fat, except that they didn't ask them to endorse the final document. And they closed this down in June 2014. No studies after that, and some of the most important studies have come out since then. And that may be one of the biggest arguments for them to redo this, is so much important science has come out since they closed it. So as Canadians, what should we expect of this new food guide and the science behind it? We need to know who made this decision, what were their credentials, and are they free of bias? They need to ask questions of the literature, not just against saturated fat. They need to ask questions against sugar and carbohydrates and other things. And for each question asked, they need to tell us what the studies were and how they graded the evidence. They didn't do this. This is important. Issuing a guideline affects a lot of people. And if they issue it against saturated fat, it affects your family business. And if they issue it against sugar, it affects someone else's family business. And if they issue it against wheat, it affects someone else's family business. You need, if you're going to have this kind of impact, this multi-million-dollar impact, you need to do good science. So I'm not here to argue there should be any influence. There should not be influence on Health Canada, but they should be transparent and tell us how they did it, and they should do good science. And they did not do good science on this. And I'll also point out that lots of people are raising concern about industry influence. And that's okay. Industry should not influence their decision. It should be based on science. But there's another kind of influence, is moral and religious influence. And that's equally important. So just as the government says that industry should not influence our food guide, and they should not, then religions that are against meat and ethical principles like veganism that's against meat are equally biased influences and should not be allowed either. This should be based strictly on the science, and I can tell you, if you argue for that, the science will not say to restrict saturated fat. There isn't any evidence there. The food guide needs to have rigorous science, and we need to argue for rigorous science. And right now, all across Canada, there's an upswelling of family doctors who are using saturated fat and low carbohydrates to make people healthy. 2 years ago, there were 700 family doctors in this group that uses low carbohydrate, high fat diet to make their patients healthier. This year, it's 2,500 and growing. I go to the family medicine conferences, and it is one of the biggest areas of talk. So if Health Canada moves forward and does what they said, you could be going to your family doctor if you're diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and be put on a diet that's low carbohydrate and high fat, and mostly you'll be eating things with red warning labels on them because they contain saturated fat. That's embarrassing for our country and for Health Canada when you're getting healthier eating a diet with a whole bunch of red stickers on it from Health Canada. We need to act now. And we need not to be issuing guidelines that aren't scientifically based. We saw what happened when Ansel Keys did it in 1961. We saw what happened when George McGovern and the Senate committee released their guidelines without evidence in 1977. 2 of his guidelines, probably 3, are already false. People always say we have to act now before all the evidence is in, like Senator McGovern said. No. It's too dangerous, it's too wrong, and we hurt people if we don't have science behind this. I wouldn't give you a drug to help prevent a disease without science behind it. I wouldn't experiment with you giving you a drug. I'm not certainly going to do it with food. And then the other argument people have is it's too difficult to do diet studies. Well, there's lots of studies out there. You just have to look at them. And when you look at them, you'll find that the evidence isn't there. So, as a doctor, this isn't an unusual situation to have science not decide things. Literally, it happens every day. And what do I do as a doctor when I don't know if drug 1, drug 2, drug 3, they're all proven to be the same? We try one and switch to another. We allow the patient to choose. We go with the cheapest one. We tailor it around. So if saturated fat, a diet that's high in saturated fat, is no different by the evidence than one that's low in fat, then both of those are reasonable to get you healthier. Health Canada should not be picking sides. They should say, if you want to try low fat, and if that's not working, why don't you try saturated fat diet? That's what we do as doctors. And I can tell you, we've been trying this low fat thing since 1977. It's not working. There's the position statement for heart and stroke. It meshes with the other ones. It does not put a limit on saturated fat. It recommends avoiding refined foods. Avoiding processed foods is probably the important thing. When you have highly refined and processed foods, literally, it's fat, it's sugar, it's flour, it's all the things combined. But if you eat whole natural ingredients, then you're shopping for food every 1 to 2 days. It's a European market model. You cook from fresh ingredients, and then you should go to restaurants that prepare fresh food. Shop around the edge of the store, around the edge of the metro, not in the middle where all the processed food is. Quench your thirst with water. We put so much sugar-sweetened beverages, including juice, in our... We should be quenching our thirst with water, lots of fresh fruit and veg, and in that diet, dairy can be an important part because it makes your diet taste more palatable, and it's probably not important. So, the one message that I come forward, and this is not evidence, but this is the best way to fit the evidence together, is just focus on your whole diet and your processed food. If you eat natural, fresh ingredients and take 45 minutes to cook before you do it, then that ties together everything. It removes the sugars, the flours, the processed fats. It encourages healthy snacking. It embraces all the kinds of diets, and it's what Health Canada should be recommending. And until we have evidence that conclusively shows things like saturated fat are bad, they shouldn't be saying it, but they are. Thank you. And this final one, I put the heart healthy check mark, and I put it on things that are high in saturated fat because we don't see that enough. There isn't any evidence to suggest otherwise, and I'm happy to take some questions.